What would you do if 7 months pregnant, you discovered your husband was secretly planning another wedding? Sarah Mitchell thought she was losing her mind when she opened his laptop wedding invitations, the venue, the guest list, the perfect dress, but the bride wasn't her. It was his 26-year-old assistant, and yet betrayal was only the beginning. When Sarah crashed that ceremony baby bump showing, court order in hand, she uncovered something far darker than infidelity. Her charming billionaire husband had done this before. His first wife. She didn't survive to tell the story. This is the shocking true account of how one pregnant woman's fight for the truth exposed a serial predator hiding behind a billion-dollar smile. Sarah Mitchell stood in her granite kitchen, 7 months pregnant, staring at her husband's phone screen in disbelief. The calendar notification had popped up while she was trying to order groceries using his account. Venue tasting with M, 2 p.m., Sterling Gardens. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through David's messages. Madison Clare, his marketing director, had sent detailed wedding planning documents, color schemes, guest lists, menu preferences, everything Sarah had dreamed of for their own wedding renewal that David kept postponing. "You're being paranoid again," David had said last week when she mentioned feeling excluded from his work events. "The pregnancy is making you emotional. Remember what happened last time." Last time. Their first pregnancy had ended in miscarriage 2 years ago. David blamed her stress levels, her inability to relax. The guilt still consumed her midnight thoughts. But this wasn't paranoia. This was evidence. Sarah screenshot everything before David's phone auto-locked. Her heart pounded as she heard his Tesla pulling into their driveway. She quickly returned to chopping vegetables, fighting to keep her expression neutral. "Hey, beautiful." David kissed her cheek, his usual charm on full display. At 35, he still looked like the ambitious entrepreneur she'd fallen for at Stanford. "How's my little family today?" "We're good," Sarah managed. "How was your day?" "Busy. Investors are breathing down my neck about the quarterly projections." He loosened his tie, moving around their open-concept kitchen with practiced ease. "Madison's been incredible, though, really stepping up to handle the marketing push." Madison, always Madison. Sarah had given up her investment banking career at Goldman Sachs to support David's startup dream. She'd used her trust fund for initial capital, worked 16-hour days editing pitch decks, networking with her Wall Street contacts, but somehow, in David's version of their success story, Madison was the hero. "David," Sarah said carefully, "I was wondering if we could finally plan that renewal ceremony for our 5th anniversary next month." His smile faltered slightly. "Honey, you know timing is terrible right now. Once the baby comes and things settle down at work." "You said that last year." "Because last year you were still recovering from—" He caught himself. "Look, I want to do this right, not rushed because of pregnancy hormones." There it was, the subtle dig that made her question her own feelings. David had perfected this technique over their 5-year marriage. Every concern became pregnancy hormones, or stress, or overthinking. "I found something on your phone," Sarah said quietly. David's expression didn't change, but she caught the slight tension in his shoulders. "What do you mean, Sterling Gardens? Today, with Madison?" He laughed, the sound warm and believable. "Oh, that. Madison's planning her sister's engagement party. Asked if I'd help since we used Sterling for our own wedding. I was just being supportive." The explanation came so smoothly that Sarah almost believed it. Almost. But she'd seen the guest list. Her name wasn't on it. David's was her sister's engagement party, Sarah repeated. "Madison's really close to her family. You remember how important that is." Another subtle manipulation. Sarah's parents had died in a car accident during college. David knew exactly how to weaponize her grief. That night, while David slept beside her, Sarah lay awake feeling their baby kick against her ribs. She thought about the woman she used to be, the Sarah who'd closed million-dollar deals, who'd never let anyone gaslight her in a boardroom. When had she become this person, this woman who apologized for her own intuition? She made a decision. Tomorrow, she would call her sister Elena. Tomorrow, she would start fighting back. But first, she needed more evidence. Elena Vasquez had built her career on exposing the truth. As an investigative journalist for the Washington Herald, she'd broken stories about corporate fraud, political corruption, and social injustice. But when her younger sister called at midnight, crying about wedding planning documents, Elena's first instinct was skepticism. "Sarah, honey, you're 7 months pregnant. Your hormones are all over the place." "Don't you start too," Sarah snapped. "I know what I saw." They met the next morning at a coffee shop in downtown Austin, away from David's usual haunts. Elena studied her sister across the small table. Sarah looked exhausted, her usually perfect blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, designer maternity clothes wrinkled. "Show me everything," Elena said. Sarah pulled out printed screenshots. Elena's journalist instincts kicked in as she reviewed the evidence. The documents were detailed, professional. This wasn't the work of someone planning a sister's party. "Have you confronted him directly?" "He has an explanation for everything. He always does." Sarah's voice cracked. "Elena, I think I'm losing my mind. Or maybe I already have." "Tell me about the miscarriage." Sarah flinched. "What does that have to do with anything? You mentioned David blamed your stress levels. Walk me through what happened." As Sarah recounted those painful months, Elena took careful notes. The story troubled her. David's reaction had been to increase control, not provide support. He'd insisted on managing all medical appointments, filtered information from doctors, made decisions about Sarah's treatment. "Sarah, I need to ask you something difficult. Do you think David wanted you to lose that baby?" The question hung between them like a live wire. "That's insane," Sarah whispered, but her eyes showed doubt. Elena reached across the table. "I'm going to help you, but we need to be smart about this. If David is as manipulative as you're describing, he'll be prepared for confrontation." They developed a plan. Elena would use her investigative contacts to research David's business dealings and Madison's background. Sarah would document everything at home: conversations, behaviors, financial transactions. "Most importantly," Elena said, "don't let him know you're watching. If he's really planning what we think, the element of surprise is your only advantage." That afternoon, Sarah installed a discreet recording app on her phone. She felt guilty about secretly recording her husband, but the alternative was accepting his version of reality. The first recording came that evening. "Madison's pregnant," David announced over dinner, his tone casual as he discussed quarterly earnings. Sarah's fork clattered against her plate. "What? I thought you should know before the office gossip starts. It's early, only about 8 weeks. She's not sure about keeping it." The timeline hit Sarah like ice water. 8 weeks ago, David had been working late every night. 8 weeks ago, he'd been distant, distracted during their own intimate moments. "Who's the father?" Sarah asked, though she already knew. "Some guy she was dating. Real deadbeat, apparently. She's pretty torn up about it." The lie was so smooth, so perfectly delivered, that Sarah almost missed the tell. David touched his nose when he lied. A tiny gesture she'd noticed years ago, but dismissed. He was touching his nose now. "That's terrible for her," Sarah managed. "Yeah, I told her she could take some time off if needed. We take care of our people." That night, Sarah listened to the recording 3 times. David's voice, so confident in his deception. The casual way he discussed Madison's pregnancy while his own wife carried his child. But it was the background noise that chilled her most. In the recording, she could hear herself believing him, accepting his lies, thanking him for being supportive of his employee. When had she become so powerless in her own life? Sarah placed her hands on her belly, feeling the baby's strong kicks. This child deserved better. They both did. But as she drifted off to sleep, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that David was still 3 steps ahead of her, and that her investigation had only revealed the tip of something much darker. 3 days later, Sarah discovered the depth of David's planning when she found a hidden folder on his laptop labeled SML Estate Planning. Her hands shook as she clicked through legal documents that mapped out her complete erasure. The papers detailed a strategy to have her declared mentally incompetent due to postpartum psychosis. David had been building a case for months, documenting incidents where Sarah appeared unstable or irrational, medical appointments where he'd reported her emotional outbursts, security footage from their home showing her talking to herself, except Sarah remembered those moments differently. The conversations David labeled as talking to herself were phone calls with Elena or her college friends. The emotional outbursts were normal reactions to his gaslighting. The medical appointments where he'd reported concerning behavior, she'd been excluded from those discussions entirely. David had even hired a psychiatrist to evaluate her without her knowledge. Dr. Richard Hayes had observed Sarah during what she thought were routine social gatherings. His report described a woman showing signs of paranoid delusions, emotional instability, and concerning attachment to conspiracy theories about her husband's fidelity. The final document was a court petition to declare Sarah Mitchell legally incompetent, with David Mitchell requesting guardianship over both her person and estate. Sarah printed everything before the laptop auto-locked. Her trust fund, inherited from her parents, was worth $12 million. David needed her alive but powerless to access that money indefinitely. She called Elena immediately. "He's going to have me institutionalized," Sarah whispered into the phone. "Elena, I need help. Real help." "Pack a bag," Elena said. "Come to my apartment right now." But David arrived home early. "What are you doing?" he asked, finding Sarah with a half-packed suitcase. "I know everything," Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt. "The estate planning, the psychiatrist, Madison's pregnancy timeline, all of it." David's expression didn't change. He sat on their bed, studying her with the same analytical look he used during board meetings. "Sarah, honey, you're having an episode. This is exactly what Dr. Hayes warned about. I've never met Dr. Hayes. You were introduced to him at the Morrisons' dinner party last month. You shook his hand. We talked about his research into postpartum psychosis." David's voice remained calm, reasonable. "You don't remember because you're sick?" Sarah's confidence wavered. She did remember the Morrisons' party. She'd met several people that night. Had one of them been Dr. Hayes? "The estate planning documents are standard precautions recommended by our financial advisor. After what happened with your parents' accident, I wanted to make sure our family was protected if something happened to either of us." Every accusation met with a reasonable explanation. Every piece of evidence reframed as proof of her deteriorating mental state. Madison's pregnancy is a private matter that doesn't concern us. Sarah, you're obsessing over my coworker's personal life. That's not healthy behavior. David stood and gently guided her to sit beside him. His touch was warm, familiar. For a moment, Sarah felt like she was drowning in confusion. "I love you," he said softly. "I love our baby." but you need help. Professional help. Dr. Hayes has a residential program that specializes in pregnancy-related mental health issues. You want to send me away? I want to protect you. Protect our family. Sarah, you tried to access my work computer without permission. You've been recording our private conversations. You called Elena at midnight with paranoid theories. These aren't the actions of a healthy person. Sarah stared at him. How did he know about the recordings, about her conversation with Elena? As if reading her thoughts, David pulled out his phone. I've been monitoring your devices for your own safety. The recording app, the screenshots, the research into my business. Sarah, you're stalking your own husband. The evidence of her investigation presented as proof of her mental illness. Her fight for truth repositioned as symptoms of psychosis. Pack your bag, David said gently. We're going to get you the help you need. Sarah looked around their bedroom, wedding photos on the nightstand, baby clothes folded in the corner, the life she'd built now revealed as an elaborate cage. She had two choices: resist and prove his point about her mental state, or comply and disappear into whatever facility David had chosen. Okay, she whispered. David smiled and kissed her forehead. That's my brave girl. Everything's going to be fine. But as Sarah packed her bag under David's watchful eye, she pressed the record button on her phone one more time. If she was going down, she would document every moment of her destruction. Peaceful Meadows Recovery Center looked exactly like the upscale wellness retreat Sarah had visited during happier times. Rolling hills, organic gardens, yoga pavilions, and therapy horses grazing in manicured pastures. The kind of place where celebrities went to recover from exhaustion. David had chosen well. Mrs. Mitchell, Dr. Rebecca Stone greeted them at reception. We're so glad you're here. Your husband has told us so much about your situation. Sarah wanted to ask what exactly David had told them, but she'd learned to stay quiet. Every question became evidence of paranoia. Every concern proved her instability. Sarah's been having a difficult pregnancy, David explained, his arm protectively around her shoulders. Paranoid thoughts, conspiracy theories about our marriage. Her sister Elena has been encouraging these delusions. Dr. Stone nodded sympathetically. Pregnancy-induced psychosis is more common than people realize. The hormonal changes can create very convincing false realities. I'm not psychotic, Sarah said quietly. Of course this feels real to you. Dr. Stone replied, That's what makes treatment so important. We'll help you distinguish between reality and the stories your mind is creating. The intake process took 3 hours. Sarah answered questions about her childhood, her marriage, her fears about motherhood. Every honest answer was documented as further evidence of her condition. When David finally left, Sarah felt truly alone for the first time in years. Her room was comfortable but secure. Windows that didn't fully open. No access to phones or computers without supervision. Meals delivered at scheduled times. Group therapy sessions where she listened to other women describe their journeys back to mental health. Sarah tried to participate. She attended yoga classes, art therapy, and individual counseling sessions with Dr. Stone. But every conversation felt like a trap. Tell me about your relationship with your sister, Dr. Stone would ask. Elena's an investigative journalist. She's helped me research some concerns about my husband's business. And what kind of concerns? Sarah had learned not to mention the wedding planning or Madison's pregnancy. Those topics immediately triggered notes about delusional jealousy and paranoid fixation. Financial concerns, Sarah said carefully. Has your husband given you reason to worry about money? No, but... So these financial concerns exist only in your mind. Every session ended the same way. Sarah's legitimate questions reframed as symptoms requiring medication adjustment. The pills made everything fuzzy. Sarah couldn't think clearly, couldn't maintain focus long enough to plan, which was exactly the point. 3 weeks into her stay, Elena finally managed to visit. "You look terrible," Elena said bluntly. They sat in the garden pavilion under staff supervision. Sarah had lost weight despite her pregnancy. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. "They're medicating me," Sarah whispered. "Elena, I can barely think straight. I've been researching David's business. There are irregularities in the financial filings, connections to offshore accounts. I think you were right about everything." Sarah glanced at the supervising nurse, who was typing notes on her tablet. "Elena, you need to stop. Please. I'm sick." "David's trying to help me." Elena's eyes widened. "Sarah, what are they doing to you?" "I had paranoid delusions about my husband. I created conspiracy theories to avoid dealing with my mental health. I'm grateful David got me the help I need." The words felt foreign in Sarah's mouth, but she'd been practicing them in therapy. "Dr. Stone called it accepting reality." "Bullshit," Elena said loudly. The nurse looked up. "Sarah, I know you. This isn't you talking." "Ma'am, I need to ask you to lower your voice." The nurse intervened. "My sister is being held against her will. This is kidnapping. Your sister is receiving voluntary treatment for a serious mental health condition. She can leave at any time." Elena turned to Sarah. "Then leave. Right now. Walk out with me." Sarah wanted to. Every fiber of her being screamed to run, but David's voice echoed in her mind. "If you leave treatment early, it proves you're not committed to recovery. The court will see that as evidence that you're an unfit mother." "I need to stay," Sarah said. "I need to get better." Elena stared at her sister for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was cold. "Fine. When you're ready to stop playing victim and start fighting for your child, call me." Elena left without looking back. That night, Sarah lay in her narrow bed feeling the baby kick against her ribs. Outside her window, she could see the parking lot where Elena's car had been, her last ally, gone. Dr. Stone had been right about one thing. Sarah was creating stories to avoid facing reality. The reality was that she had already lost. On her 28th day at Peaceful Meadows, Sarah discovered she wasn't the first Mitchell wife to receive treatment there. It happened during art therapy, when Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly patient with Alzheimer's, mistook Sarah for someone else. "Michelle, dear, you're looking better," Mrs. Rodriguez said, studying Sarah's pregnancy silhouette. "That husband of yours was so worried when you lost the first baby." Sarah's paintbrush froze halfway to the canvas. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" "Such a shame about the miscarriage. But David explained how your medication affected the pregnancy. These antidepressants can be so dangerous for developing babies." The art therapy instructor quickly intervened. "Mrs. Rodriguez is confused about time and people. Please don't take anything she says seriously." But Sarah couldn't stop thinking about it. That evening, she convinced a night nurse to help her access old patient records under the pretense of updating her medical history. Michelle Atwood Mitchell, David's first wife. Sarah stared at the file in disbelief. David had been married before, from 2015 to 2017. Michelle had been treated at Peaceful Meadows for severe depression following multiple miscarriages. According to the records, Michelle had been prescribed high doses of psychiatric medication that were later discovered to be incompatible with pregnancy. She'd lost 3 babies over 2 years, each miscarriage triggering deeper depression and longer treatment stays. Michelle's final stay had ended when she suffered a fatal allergic reaction to a new medication protocol. The death was ruled accidental, complicated by an underlying heart condition that had never been diagnosed. David inherited Michelle's trust fund and life insurance, $700,000. Sarah felt sick. She ran to the bathroom and vomited until only bile remained. The pattern was identical. Wealthy wife, mysterious mental health crisis, pregnancy complications, increasing medication, isolation from family support. The only difference was scale. Sarah's trust fund was worth $12 million instead of $700,000. She had to get out. Tonight. But when Sarah tried to leave her room, she discovered the doors were locked. Not just secured, actively locked from the outside. "I need to leave," she told the night nurse. "I'm here voluntarily. I have the right to discharge myself." "Mrs. Mitchell, you're experiencing a crisis episode. Dr. Stone has placed you on a 72-hour hold for your own safety. Based on what you accessed confidential patient files, you're showing signs of paranoid delusion and agitation. These are symptoms of acute psychosis." Sarah laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "Wanting to leave makes me psychotic. Wanting to leave after discovering information that feeds your conspiracy theories. Yes, Mrs. Mitchell, you believe your husband murdered his first wife? That's not rational thinking." Sarah stared at the nurse. How did they know what she'd discovered? The file room had been empty. She'd been alone, unless the rooms were monitored. "I need to call my sister." Phone privileges are suspended during crisis holds. Dr. Stone will reevaluate your status in 72 hours. Sarah was escorted back to her room. This time, she heard the lock engage clearly. She sat on her bed, hands pressed against her pregnant belly, and forced herself to think clearly despite the medication fog. David had killed Michelle, not directly, but through systematic psychological and medical abuse. He'd isolated her, convinced everyone she was mentally ill, then used the treatment itself as a weapon. And he was doing the same thing to Sarah. The baby kicked hard, as if responding to her mother's distress. Sarah whispered apologies to her unborn daughter. She'd failed to protect them both. But then she remembered something Elena had taught her during their childhood. When someone tries to erase you, document everything. Truth leaves traces that survive longer than lies. Sarah began searching her room methodically. If this place had murdered Michelle, there would be evidence, cameras, recording devices, something to document the process. She found the listening device taped under her bedside table, working carefully in the darkness. Sarah dismantled the small recorder. Inside was a micro SD card containing weeks of audio files, her private conversations with Dr. Stone, phone calls with David, even her whispered prayers late at night. But more importantly, there were older files, recordings from Michelle's stay. Sarah listened to her predecessor's voice through the tiny speaker, hearing her own fears echoed across the years. Michelle questioning her medication. Michelle begging to call her family. Michelle discovering the truth about her miscarriages. And David's voice, calm and loving, convincing everyone that his wife's concerns were symptoms of her deteriorating mental state. The final recording was Michelle pleading with a nurse, "Please, I think my heart is racing because of the new medication. Something's wrong. Please check with my cardiologist." "Mrs. Mitchell, anxiety can cause heart palpitations. Dr. Stone has ordered a sedative to help you rest." Michelle died 6 hours later. Sarah gripped the tiny device, evidence of murder hidden in plain sight, but she was still locked in the same facility, under the care of the same doctor, following the same protocol that had killed Michelle. The baby kicked again, and Sarah made a promise to her daughter, "I won't let him win, whatever it takes. I won't let him win. But first, she had to survive the next 72 hours. Sarah's salvation came from an impossible source, Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman with Alzheimer's who'd mistaken her for Michelle. On her second night of the crisis hold, Mrs. Rodriguez shuffled into Sarah's room during the late shift change. The staff assumed she was wandering again, a common occurrence with dementia patients. "Michelle, dear," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered, "I saved them for you." She pressed a bundle of papers into Sarah's hands, medical records, staff schedules, and photocopies of incident reports spanning 5 years. "I'm not Michelle," Sarah said gently. "Michelle died." Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes suddenly focused with startling clarity. "I know who you are. I know what David Mitchell does to his wives. I was a nurse here for 40 years before the Alzheimer's. I've been documenting everything." Sarah stared at the evidence in her hands. Detailed records of Michelle's treatment, including notes Dr. Stone had attempted to destroy, medication dosages that exceeded safe levels, cardiac monitoring data showing heart distress that was ignored. "Dr. Stone knows you're not really sick," Mrs. Rodriguez continued. "She killed Michelle on David's orders. Now they're planning the same for you, but they need to wait until after the baby is born. Why are you helping me? Because I had a daughter once. She married a man like David. I didn't recognize the signs until it was too late." Mrs. Rodriguez's voice broke. "I won't let it happen again." Mrs. Rodriguez explained the facility's security weaknesses. During shift changes at 3 a.m., there was a 10-minute window when the medication room was unmonitored. The locks were electronic, controlled by key cards that were left in charging stations. "You get one chance," Mrs. Rodriguez warned. "If they catch you, they'll increase your medication to levels that could harm the baby." That night, Sarah waited until the facility settled into its pre-dawn quiet. At 2:55 a.m., she slipped out of her room using Mrs. Rodriguez's stolen key card. The medication room contained detailed files on every patient. Sarah photographed Michelle's complete records with Mrs. Rodriguez's smuggled cell phone, including Dr. Stone's personal notes about maintaining the treatment narrative and ensuring inheritance transfer. But she also discovered something worse. Sarah wasn't David's only current target. Madison Clare had been admitted to Peaceful Meadows 2 weeks ago for pregnancy-related anxiety. Her file showed the same progression: isolation from family, increasing medication, documented episodes of paranoid behavior. David was disposing of both his wife and his mistress simultaneously. Sarah found Madison in the restricted wing, heavily sedated but conscious. "Sarah?" Madison struggled to focus. "What are you doing here?" "Saving both our lives. Madison, David's going to kill us." "That's crazy. David loves me. He's protecting me from your harassment." Even now, Madison believed David's lies. Sarah showed her the photographs of Michelle's files, the evidence of systematic murder disguised as medical treatment. "The baby you're carrying," Sarah said gently. "How far along?" 12 weeks. But I've been having complications. Bleeding, heart palpitations. Dr. Stone says it's normal." "Those aren't complications. That's poisoning. The same thing that killed Michelle." Madison's eyes widened as the truth penetrated her medicated confusion. "David said you were obsessed with me, that you'd been making threats." "I never threatened you. I didn't even know about you until 3 weeks ago." Sarah helped Madison sit up, fighting against the sedatives. "Madison, I need you to listen carefully. David married Michelle in 2015. She died here in 2017 after losing 3 babies. He inherited her money and immediately started dating me. Now he's married to me, dating you, and planning to inherit from both of us." but he loves me. He said he'd divorce you after the baby came. He said the same thing to you that he said to Michelle about me. Madison, look around. Does this look like protection or imprisonment? Madison began to cry, the medications making her emotions unpredictable. But through the tears, Sarah saw recognition. What do? We get out. Tonight. Together. Using Mrs. Rodriguez's security knowledge, Sarah and Madison made their way through the facility's blind spots. The parking garage held David's Tesla, which Sarah knew how to operate from their shared account. As they drove away from Peaceful Meadows, Madison asked, "Where are we going?" "To find someone who can expose this whole thing." Sarah called Elena from Madison's phone. Her sister answered on the first ring. "Madison, it's 3 a.m. Where's Sarah?" "Elena, it's me. I'm with Madison. We just escaped from the facility." Elena, "David killed his first wife. He's been planning to kill both of us." Silence stretched across the connection. "Where are you?" Elena asked finally. "Driving north on Highway 35. Elena, we have evidence. Medical records, recordings, everything. Come to my apartment. We're going to end this tonight." As Austin's skyline disappeared behind them, Sarah felt hope for the first time in weeks. She wasn't alone anymore. She had allies, evidence, and most importantly, she had the truth. But David's reach extended far beyond Peaceful Meadows, and he would already know they were gone. Elena's apartment looked like a war room. Corkboards covered with photographs, documents pinned with red string connecting David's associates, financial records spread across every surface. Sarah realized her sister had been investigating for weeks. "Jesus, you both look terrible," Elena said, helping them inside. Madison collapsed on the couch, still fighting the effects of sedation. Sarah moved carefully, her pregnant belly making every motion deliberate. "Show me everything," Elena demanded. Sarah uploaded the photographs from Mrs. Rodriguez's phone while Madison provided details about her own recruitment. The pattern was sickeningly consistent. "David approaches successful women with assets," Elena summarized. "He presents himself as the perfect partner, supportive and ambitious. He isolates them from family and friends while building financial dependency. When they become inconvenient, he has them declared mentally incompetent and commits them to Peaceful Meadows, where Dr. Stone slowly kills them with psychiatric medications." "How many?" Sarah asked. "Based on my research, at least 4 women over 8 years. Michelle was the 3rd. You two were meant to be 4 and 5. Elena pulled out a thick folder. But David made a mistake this time. He got greedy. The folder contained evidence of massive financial fraud. David had been using his victims' trust funds to finance his business expansion, creating shell companies to hide the stolen money. He'd also been receiving insurance payouts and inheritance transfers that should have triggered federal investigations. "I've been working with the FBI Financial Crimes Unit," Elena explained. "They've been building a case against David for months, but they needed inside access to his current operations." Sarah stared at her sister. "You've been using me as bait. I've been protecting you while gathering evidence. Sarah, this is bigger than one abusive husband. David's running a systematic wealth extraction operation. He's murdered multiple women for their money." Madison struggled to sit up. "So what do we do now?" "Now we set a trap," Elena said. "David doesn't know you've escaped yet. The facility won't report you missing until morning rounds at 6 a.m. That gives us 3 hours. Elena outlined the plan. Sarah would return home, pretending the facility had released her for a family emergency. She'd wear a recording device and try to get David to confess his intentions. Meanwhile, Elena would coordinate with federal agents positioned around their house. It's too dangerous, Madison protested. What if he realizes Sarah knows the truth? Then we'll have attempted murder on tape in addition to the financial crimes. Sarah looked at her reflection in Elena's bathroom mirror. She looked exactly like what she was, a frightened, pregnant woman who'd been psychologically tortured for weeks. David would expect her to be broken, compliant. He was about to discover his mistake. At 5:30 a.m., Sarah used her key to enter the house she'd shared with David for 3 years. Everything looked exactly the same, but now she saw it differently. The expensive furniture bought with her trust fund money, the art collection purchased with Michelle's inheritance, the smart home technology that had been monitoring her conversations. David was in the kitchen making coffee, dressed for work despite the early hour. Sarah, what are you doing here? They released me for a family emergency, Sarah said, keeping her voice flat and medicated sounding. Elena's in the hospital. Car accident. David's expression showed concern, but Sarah caught the flicker of suspicion in his eyes. Honey, that's terrible. But are you sure you should be here? Dr. Stone said you need to complete the full treatment program. I told them I'd go back tomorrow. I just needed to see Elena. David moved closer, studying her face. You look better, clearer. Maybe the treatment is working. I feel different, Sarah agreed. Like I can think more clearly about our situation. What kind of thoughts? Sarah sat heavily on their kitchen stool, one hand on her belly. I've been thinking about Michelle. David went very still. Who's Michelle? Your first wife, the one who died at Peaceful Meadows. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah could hear the coffee maker gurgling, the subtle hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of Austin traffic beginning to build. Sarah, David said finally, there is no Michelle. This is exactly the kind of paranoid delusion Dr. Stone warned about. I found her medical records. I have photographs of everything. David's mask slipped completely. The charming, concerned husband vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. You couldn't have found anything because you've been locked in a secure facility. Mrs. Rodriguez helped me. She was a nurse there for 40 years. She documented everything. David pulled out his phone and made a call. Dr. Stone. Yes, we have a problem. Sarah's having a severe psychotic break. She's creating elaborate conspiracy theories about fictional people. Sarah listened to his performance, marveling at his skill. Even now, facing exposure, David was trying to control the narrative. She needs to be sedated and returned immediately. David continued into the phone. Yes, I understand the risks to the pregnancy, but she's becoming dangerous. He hung up and smiled at Sarah. Help is coming, honey. You're very sick, but we're going to take care of you. The way you took care of Michelle. There is no Michelle, David shouted, his composure finally cracking. Just like there's no conspiracy, no murder plot, no evidence of anything except your deteriorating mental state. Sarah pulled out Mrs. Rodriguez's phone and played the recording of Michelle's final moments. David's face went white as his first wife's voice filled their kitchen, begging for medical attention that never came. Where did you get that? Does it matter, David? It's over. The FBI knows everything. David lunged for the phone, but Sarah was ready. She threw it to the floor and stomped on it with her heel, destroying the device, but not before Elena's remote access had uploaded everything to federal servers. You have no idea what you've done, David said, his voice deadly quiet. I know exactly what I've done. I've stopped you from killing again. David grabbed a kitchen knife from the block beside the stove. No, he said. You forced me to change the timeline. Sarah backed toward the living room as David advanced with the knife. Her pregnant body made movement awkward, but fear gave her focus. David, put the knife down. This won't solve anything. Actually, it solves everything, David replied, his voice eerily calm. Mentally unstable pregnant woman attacks loving husband with kitchen knife. Tragic struggle ends with wife's accidental death. Grieving widower inherits estate and raises questions about the facility that failed to protect his family. The FBI is already investigating you. Based on what? The ramblings of a woman who's been institutionalized for psychiatric treatment, the confused memories of an Alzheimer's patient. David smiled. Sarah, even if you had evidence, you've been declared mentally incompetent. Your testimony is worthless. Sarah's back hit the wall beside their fireplace. Nowhere left to retreat. Madison will testify. Madison is also a patient at Peaceful Meadows, being treated for pregnancy-induced psychosis. Her credibility is equally compromised. David raised the knife, and Sarah realized he'd been planning this conversation, this moment, probably since the day she discovered his affair. You killed Michelle, Sarah said, buying time. Michelle killed herself with her paranoid obsessions and refusal to take proper medication, just like you're about to kill yourself and my unborn child with your delusional conspiracy theories. That baby isn't yours. David paused. What did you say? The baby. It's not yours. I had an affair with James Morrison, my attorney. The timing matches perfectly. It was a lie, but Sarah saw it hit David like a physical blow. His entire plan depended on being the grieving father of an unborn child. You're lying. DNA test will prove it. David, you've been planning to murder me for money that won't even be yours. David's grip on the knife tightened. Then, I guess, I'll have to make sure you both disappear before any tests can be run. He stepped forward, and Sarah grabbed the poker from the fireplace tools beside her. Stay back. Sarah, you're 7 months pregnant. You can barely stand up straight. Put the poker down before you hurt yourself. Like Michelle hurt herself. Michelle was weak. She believed her own delusions until they killed her. But you, David studied Sarah's face. You know exactly what you're doing. That makes you much more dangerous. He lunged. Sarah swung the poker with all her strength, catching David across the forearm. He dropped the knife but grabbed her wrist, twisting until she cried out, FBI, drop your weapon. The front door exploded inward as federal agents flooded their living room. David released Sarah and raised his hands, the kitchen knife at his feet. Thank God you're here, David said immediately, switching back to his concerned husband persona. My wife is having a psychotic break. She attacked me with that fireplace poker. Agent Rebecca Torres, Elena's FBI contact, looked between David and Sarah. Blood streaked David's arm where the poker had connected. Sarah stood pressed against the wall, pregnant and terrified. Mr. Mitchell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, and attempted assault with a deadly weapon. This is insane. My wife is mentally ill. She's been institutionalized for weeks. We have recordings of this entire conversation, Torres replied. Including your admission to murdering Michelle Atwood Mitchell. David's face went blank. That's impossible. Mrs. Mitchell has been wearing a wire since she entered this house. We heard everything. Sarah pulled the small recording device from her maternity shirt. Elena had hidden it in the seam during their preparation. As the agents handcuffed David, he looked at Sarah with something approaching admiration. You really had me convinced you were broken, he said. I was broken, Sarah replied. But I put myself back together. Ma'am, we need to get you to a hospital for evaluation. Agent Torres said to Sarah, You've been through significant trauma. What about Madison? We're coordinating with Austin PD to raid Peaceful Meadows. Dr. Stone and her staff will be arrested within the hour. As the agents led David away, he turned back to Sarah one final time. You think this is over? I have lawyers, connections, money. I'll be out in 6 months, and when you are, Elena said, stepping through the broken front door. You'll be facing federal charges in 4 states for the murders of at least 6 women. David, you're never getting out. Sarah watched her husband disappear into the back of an FBI vehicle. 5 years of marriage, reduced to evidence in a criminal case. Sarah, Elena said gently, it's really over. Sarah nodded, one hand on her belly where the baby was kicking frantically, responding to her mother's elevated heart rate. I know, she said. We're free. 6 months later, Sarah stood in a federal courthouse holding her 3-month-old daughter, Grace Elena Mitchell. The baby had been born healthy, despite everything, a determined little girl who seemed to have inherited her mother's fighting spirit. David's trial had been a media sensation. Elena's investigation had uncovered evidence of 8 murders spanning 12 years, with victims across 4 states. David Mitchell wasn't just a serial killer. He was a sophisticated predator who'd built an entire system around murdering wealthy women for their inheritances. Dr. Rebecca Stone had pled guilty in exchange for testimony against David. Peaceful Meadows Recovery Center had been shut down permanently, its staff facing various charges for medical fraud and conspiracy. Mrs. Mitchell. The prosecutor approached Sarah in the courthouse hallway. Are you ready for your testimony? Sarah looked at Elena, who was holding Grace while Sarah prepared to face David one final time. I'm ready. The courtroom was packed with media, families of David's victims, and supporters who'd followed Sarah's story. She walked to the witness stand feeling stronger than she had in years. David sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, his charming mask finally gone forever. He looked ordinary now, diminished. Sarah felt nothing when she looked at him. Not anger, not fear, not even satisfaction. Just peace. Mrs. Mitchell, the prosecutor began, please tell the court about your marriage to the defendant. For the next 2 hours, Sarah recounted everything. The gaslighting, the financial manipulation, the systematic isolation, the discovery of Michelle's fate, the escape from Peaceful Meadows. Her voice remained steady throughout, factual and clear. During cross-examination, David's attorney tried to attack her credibility. Mrs. Mitchell, you were institutionalized for psychiatric treatment. How can the jury trust your version of events when you've been diagnosed with mental illness? I was never mentally ill, Sarah replied calmly. I was being slowly poisoned with psychiatric medications while my husband built a legal case to have me declared incompetent. The medical records prove that every symptom I experienced was caused by the treatment itself. But you did exhibit paranoid behavior, obsessive thoughts about your husband's fidelity. I exhibited normal reactions to discovering my husband was planning to murder me for my inheritance. Any rational person would have the same concerns. The attorney pressed harder. Mrs. Mitchell, isn't it true that you broke into your husband's personal files, recorded private conversations without consent, and fled from a medical facility against professional advice? Sarah looked directly at the jury. Yes, I broke laws to save my own life and the life of my unborn child. I would do it again without hesitation. The courtroom erupted in applause before the judge restored order. When Sarah's testimony ended, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She'd told the truth. completely and publicly. Whatever happened next, she'd reclaimed her voice. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. David Mitchell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, followed by additional consecutive sentences that ensured he would never be free again. Outside the courthouse, Sarah faced a crowd of reporters. Mrs. Mitchell, what would you say to other women who might be in similar situations? Sarah shifted Grace to her other arm, thinking carefully about her answer. I would say that your instincts are probably right. If someone is making you question your own reality, if they're isolating you from people who care about you, if they're controlling your access to money or medical care, trust yourself, document everything, find allies, and remember that surviving abuse isn't just about getting out. It's about reclaiming who you were before they tried to erase you. What's next for you? Sarah looked at Elena, who was launching a nonprofit to help women document and escape financial abuse. She looked at Grace, who would grow up knowing her mother was strong enough to fight for both their lives. I'm starting a foundation in memory of Michelle Atwood Mitchell and the other women David murdered. We're going to change laws around involuntary psychiatric commitment, train medical professionals to recognize signs of systematic abuse, and provide legal support for women trapped in situations like mine. Do you have a message for David Mitchell? Sarah paused, considering David had taken 5 years of her life, had murdered multiple women, had tried to destroy her completely. No, she said finally. I have nothing left to say to him. My message is for the women he'll never get to hurt again. You are stronger than you know. Your voice matters. And you deserve to be believed. 1 year after David's conviction, Sarah stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Texas, delivering a keynote speech on economic domestic abuse. Grace played quietly in a portable crib backstage, watched by Elena, who'd become not just an aunt but a partner in their growing foundation. They call it the perfect crime, Sarah told the audience, because it leaves no physical evidence. Financial abuse, medical gaslighting, legal manipulation. These weapons are invisible to most people. The victims look healthy, wealthy, educated. No one believes they need help. The audience included law enforcement officers, medical professionals, legal advocates, and survivors. Sarah's story had become a catalyst for nationwide reforms in how institutions handled domestic abuse cases. I was one of the lucky ones, Sarah continued. I had resources, education, family support, but David still nearly succeeded in erasing me completely. Imagine how easy it is for predators to destroy women without those advantages. During the Q&A session, a young woman raised her hand. Mrs. Mitchell, how do you deal with the fear that someone like David might come after you again? Sarah considered the question. I don't live in fear anymore because I understand something David never realized. He didn't make me weak. He revealed how strong I actually was. Every woman in this room has that same strength. Sometimes we just need help remembering it. After the speech, Sarah returned to her hotel room overlooking Austin's downtown skyline. The city looked different now, full of possibilities instead of threats. Elena was feeding Grace a bottle while scrolling through social media responses to the speech. You're trending again, Elena said. Mostly positive, though David's supporters are still claiming you're mentally unstable. Let them, Sarah replied. The truth speaks for itself. Her phone buzzed with a text from James Morrison, who'd helped her establish the foundation's legal framework. Saw your speech online. Proud of you. P.S. Madison's new center in California is opening next month. Madison had used her experience to create a residential facility for pregnant women escaping abuse. Unlike Peaceful Meadows, her center focused on empowerment rather than control, helping women rebuild their lives and protect their children. Sarah picked up Grace, who was now walking and had developed her mother's determined expression. Looking at her daughter, Sarah sometimes marveled at how different their lives had become. Grace would grow up knowing her father was a convicted murderer, but she would also grow up knowing her mother had fought for justice, had refused to be silenced, had turned personal trauma into societal change. "Tell me the story, Mama," Grace would eventually ask, and Sarah would explain how sometimes the people who are supposed to love us try to hurt us instead. But she would also explain how we can choose to be stronger than the hurt, how we can help other people find their strength, how love is supposed to feel safe instead of scary. The foundation Sarah had built in Michelle's memory had already helped hundreds of women document abuse, escape dangerous situations, and rebuild their lives. New laws had been passed requiring better oversight of psychiatric facilities. Medical professionals received training on recognizing systematic abuse disguised as mental illness. David's conviction had also exposed the broader network of corrupt professionals who enabled predators like him. Dr. Stone's testimony had led to investigations of similar facilities across the country, saving countless potential victims. That night, as Sarah tucked Grace into her crib, she thought about all the women who hadn't survived their David Mitchells. Michelle Atwood Mitchell, whose courage in documenting her abuse had ultimately saved Sarah's life. The other 6 victims whose names were now engraved on a memorial wall at the Foundation's headquarters. "They didn't die for nothing," Sarah whispered to their memory. "Their stories saved us all." She walked to the window and looked out at Austin's glittering lights. Somewhere in the darkness, federal prisons held David Mitchell and his associates, paying for their crimes. Somewhere else, women were escaping situations like Sarah's, using resources and support systems that hadn't existed before. Sarah's story had become bigger than her personal trauma. It had become a blueprint for survival, for fighting back, for transforming pain into purpose. Her phone buzzed with one final message of the night. From a stranger: "Saw your speech. Left my husband today. Thank you for showing me it was possible." Sarah smiled and typed back, "You showed yourself it was possible. I just reminded you of your strength." Grace stirred in her sleep, and Sarah sang softly, the same lullaby her own mother had sung years ago. The melody was about birds taking flight, about finding freedom in the sky, about soaring higher than anyone thought possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new women to help, new battles to fight against systems that protected predators instead of victims. But tonight, Sarah Mitchell was exactly where she belonged, safe, free, and surrounded by the family she'd chosen and protected. She had survived David's attempt to erase her. More than that, she had ensured he could never erase anyone else. The woman who'd once questioned her own reality now helped others trust theirs. The victim who'd been silenced now amplified voices across the country. Sarah Mitchell had won more than a court case. She had won back her life, her voice, and her power to protect others. And that victory would echo long after David Mitchell was forgotten, inspiring women for generations to remember, you are stronger than you know. Your truth matters, and you deserve to be believed. If Sarah's story of courage and survival moved you, show your support by hitting that like button. It helps other women find stories that might save their lives. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their instincts matter and their voice deserves to be heard. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because every week we bring you real stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when everything's on the line. Your engagement helps us reach women who might be living Sarah's nightmare right now. Together, we can make sure no one fights alone.